Hey there! So last time I showed you how you can use these CICD pipelines defined in Azure DevOps to automatically deploy changes made in Data Factory to dev, prod and other environments. That is super helpful. And today I would like to show you how to set it up from scratch. So let's get started. Alright, so let's set up this Azure CICD stuff for Data Factory. And what we'll have is something like this. So I have two resource groups that simulate my dev and prod environments. So those black rectangles are just resource groups. The first one is my DP203 resource group, the same one that we used so far in various episodes. And here I have a new instance of Data Factory called dev something. It is empty right now, so it will be easier and faster to deploy various objects. And apart from that, I have a data lake that we'll use when I will be creating a linked service. And the second environment I have is called DP203 prod. And it simply simulates my prod environment. And in this resource group, I also have a clean instance of production Data Factory called prod something. And as well, I have a data lake that again we'll use inside a linked service. And here, based on this linked service, based on those data lakes, I will show you how we can parameterize our deployments between various environments. Alright, so this is our configuration. And apart from that, everything was removed by me. So we no longer have any pipelines, any Git configuration, nothing. Let me show it to you. So right now I'm in our dev Data Factory instance. And if we go under Manage and Git Configuration tab, you can see that it is not configured at this moment. The same on production instance. Here we don't want to configure it at all, so this is fine. I also created a brand new repository called ADF CICD demo that is empty right now. It doesn't contain any data except for this README file. Then, do we have any pipelines? No, no pipelines, no environments, nothing. So basically, we are starting from scratch. And to make it easier, what my colleague did, Adam Marczak, was to publish something called Azure Enterprise Templates. And one of those templates is about configuring this CICD process for Data Factory. And what I did was to fork his repository into mine. And then I made some adjustments. So I will simply follow those steps and I encourage you to check it out. And the document that we'll be following today is called Azure Data Factory CICD Easy Plug and Play DevOps Templates. And we'll see if it is really that easy. Alright. So the first step, according to this guide, is to go to our Data Factory on dev instance and set up this Git integration. And what is recommended to use Data Factory as a root folder. So let me copy it and let me show you what we will be doing. So basically, we will configure this Git integration option. So this is our Git repository. And I will be using Azure DevOps for this purpose. And we will simply configure it in a way that every change made in our dev instance of Data Factory will be saved inside this Git repo. So let's do this. So I'm in dev instance of my Data Factory under this Git configuration tab, and let's set it up. And it's pretty easy. So let me click configure button. Then I've got to indicate to which type of repository I want to connect. And in my case, it is Azure DevOps. Then I have to select my Azure Active Directory tenant table. Then I've got to choose my DevOps organization name. In my case, it's stable on Azure. Then my project, which is called DP203. And finally, what repository I want to use to store my data. And it is called this ADF CI/CD demo. That's the brand new one. And don't worry, most of this setup will be done by someone else, by some admin, who will configure this Azure DevOps organization, set up project, and probably create an empty repository for you. So what we should configure next is the name of our collaboration branch, and the main is fine. And what I would like to change is this root folder from default / into what was suggested in the guide, to data factory. That's fine. And yes, we want to leave this import existing resources to repository checkbox. So if I had any objects here, they would be automatically imported. And finally, I've got to select which branch I want to use as a place to which those resources would be imported. And in my case, it is a main branch. So let's apply the steps. And please note that at this moment, this main branch is not yet protected, which means that direct changes to it are still possible. And at this moment, this is fine because it will help us just easier configure all of this stuff. And you can see that yes, this link between data factory and repository has been set up. We should also see something new inside our repository. So if I refresh the browser, we can see this new data factory folder, and we have this JSON definition of our data factory, which right now is super short because basically it doesn't contain any data, at least not yet. All right, so let's move forward. And the second thing we should do is to make sure that the global parameters will be scripted inside our Azure ARM template. And we can do this under Manage and then ARM template. So this is the place. And we are doing this on dev instance of data factory, like so. Now, I'm not going to deep dive about the global parameters, what they are and how to use them. Just check this checkbox. It will make your life easier in the future. All right. So then we have to switch to Azure DevOps, and we have to create a new file called package.json that will contain this information. And this data, the content of this file, is taken from Microsoft's site, where they say that you need this file to exist just to use some libraries that make this deployment easier. So let's do this. So let's create this package.json file under DevOps. So let me jump into into Azure DevOps, and let me create a new file. And it should be under DevOps directory, and it was supposed to be called package.json. Let me double check this. Yep, everything looks fine. So let's create this file. All right, the file has been added. Obviously, it is empty right now. So let me copy the content and let me paste it like so. All right. And it simply means that we'll use these Azure Data Factory utilities that were published by Microsoft in a specific version. That's it. All right. Then we also need to create a secondary YAML file, this adf-build-job, that contains various steps that will actually build our data factory. So it will compile, or it will gather all resources that are a part of data factory, and they will prepare a package that will be later deployed. So without diving into this file, let's just create it. So let me copy the name And let's create this new file. Why can't I? No, I want to stay. Let me commit this change. And let's add a new file under DevOps. And let me call it adf-build-job. That's our template that will be calling from our main pipeline. All right, and let's simply copy the contents of this build file, like so. And basically what this build job does is it expects various parameters that we'll set later on, and it starts doing the basic stuff. So it is installing Node.js, then it installs this Microsoft utility that we configured previously in the package.json file. Then it runs run build validate command that simply validates the contents of our data factory, and then it executes build export command from this utility, which generates the ARM template of our data factory, and finally it publishes this generated template file into Azure DevOps. So that's what it does. So let me commit this change. Great. And let's move forward. So now we've got to create a new pipeline in Azure DevOps, and we'll paste this code. So actually, to create a pipeline, we can do it in different ways. So actually, let me copy the name just to be consistent with the guide. And let's create a new file, like so. And let me copy the contents of this YAML file. And we'll have to configure it, because right now it has various placeholders that we'll have to fill. And this ADF Azure Pipelines YAML file, that's the definition of our CICD pipeline. So actually, let's start filling it up. As the guide says, that we've got to replace those temporary variables with our ones. All right, so what do we have to do? So we've got to first provide a path to our adf-build-job-yml file, basically to this file. And because they are in the same directory, we just can use a file name, and it will be found adf-build-job-yml. Then we've got to define in which Azure subscription this deployment is to happen. So I will simply go to my resource group, this DP203, that simulates the dev environment, and I will copy my subscription ID. That's this GOIT. So let me copy and paste it. All right. Then I have to indicate from which resource group contains our development instance of data factory that will be used to generate this build artifact. And in my case, it is this DP203 resource group, because it contains our data factory. So let me paste it. Great. Then I've got to indicate, all right, but what is the name of our data factory? And this is this dev data factory table. That's the one. So let me paste it. All right. Then we've got to indicate, all right, what is the folder inside our repository that contains this data factory objects. And in my case, because I followed the guide, it is stored under data factory, because here is the definition of our data factory. So it would be like this. And then finally, we've got to indicate where is this package.json file available, because it is necessary by this build job to get those details about the utility that is used to generate the artifact. And in my case, because I followed the guide, it is simply this DevOps directory, like so. So let me commit it. Great. So we have the build. We have a basic version of the pipeline created. And actually, let me also, inside Data Factory, let's create some dummy pipeline, just so we have something, some kind of an object. All right, let's save it. Great, so we have something. Or we could even, oh, actually, let's do it like this. But what we were asked to do is to create a new pipeline. And right now we just created this YAML file. So what we have to do is to actually go to pipelines and create a new pipeline that will be sourced from this file that we've just created. So let me create a new pipeline. And my code of the pipeline is in Azure DevOps, in Azure repos, to be more precise. It is stored in this ADF CI/CD demo repository. And we have existing file that contains this YAML definition. So let's go with this option. And I've got to provide a path to this file. So it should be something like DevOps, then ADF Azure Pipelines YAML, because that's the place. DevOps and then Azure ADF Azure Pipelines file. So it should work like so. All right, so it is done. We created the pipeline. So actually what we should do, we should run and test the pipeline, whether it works, whether it will build the package. So where is our pipeline? It's here, so let's run it. So the pipeline has been created and it starts. Actually, it waits for 3 resources, and in a second it should be started, and we'll see whether it is able to connect to Data Factory and generate the artifact. So let's wait for a second. All right, so the pipeline finished executing and it succeeded. It took like 23 seconds and the ARM template has been generated. And we should see it here. It should be published. And yes, we have this ARM template for factory JSON file that shows the code of our Data Factory. And if I open it, yep, that's the code of my Data Factory. At this moment, it's pretty short, but it should contain my pipeline. Yep. So that's the definition of my pipeline 1, because right now that's the only object that is stored in this repository. All right, so far so good. So we have finished the first phase of our pipeline, the build stage. So let's move forward to deployment. So let's create a secondary file, this adf-deploy-job under DevOps directory in repository. So let me create a new file like so, and let's copy the contents like this, and let me commit it. All right, so that's done. So we've got a build template that is used to build and generate the template of our Data Factory. And we have a template that will be used to deploy this generated artifact on various environments. So let's move on. Now, we have to somehow allow Data Factory to access Azure and deploy various objects. And the way to do this is to create something called service connections. And usually it will be configured by some administrator, and you will just ask, hey, give me this service connection. Give me a name that I should use. So if we take a look at our diagram, So it's like this. So we've got to have this service connection configured that will be used by DevOps to connect to this data factory on dev, and then to this data factory on prod, just to deploy various objects in data factory. And what the guide says is, well, create a new connection. And basically what I will do, I will create two separate connections. One CICD dev, and the second one will be called CICD prod, just to follow best practices and separate permissions, because probably we don't want connection used to deploy stuff on dev to be also able to do something on prod, because if someone makes a mistake, we want to have this separation of permissions. So how to do this? Well, I will follow a manual path, which is a little bit longer than automatic, but in this case we have a full control how these objects will be created. So what I will do is to go to Microsoft Entra ID, and I will create something called a service principal. And I know this stuff is way beyond DP203. It's an administrative admin job to create all of this stuff. But if you just would like to create this on your own, just follow my steps. So I will go into app registrations. That's the place which I could use to create a new service principal. And I will call it CICD dev. Just register this. It resulted in creation of a service principal. And for authentication purposes, I will have to create a client secret. That's one of the options, the simplest one. Let's just follow this way. So let's create a new client secret for this service principal. For CICD, let it be valid for 1 year, like so. And important thing, I have to copy the value of this secret, because otherwise, if I close this window, I won't be able to get it back. So let me copy it. I will copy it somewhere on the site, because we'll need it in a second. All right, so we created an identity that will be used here by this connection. So let's do something similar for prod. So let me create a new registration. Let me call it CICD prod. Let's register it. And let's create a new client secret for it. Again, for CICD, let's set the expiry period for 1 year. Let me copy the value of this secret. And that's it. And what we have to do next is to grant permissions to those principals on our resources. So basically, we have to assign some role. And in my case, I will grant, for simplicity, a contributor role on the whole resource group. In both cases, on dev and on prod. It makes sense when you would like to use the same service principal to deploy various resources, not only data factory. And actually, I will follow this pattern here. And I will break one best practice. I will just grant this role explicitly and directly without using Microsoft Entra group, just to make it a little bit faster. In real projects, just use groups. So I'm in the context of DP203 resource group. That's our dev environment. So let's add an assignment for a contributor role. That's the one. And I want to grant it to our CICD dev principal, like so. All right, so this is done. And we would like to do something similar on prod, but using a different but using a different principle. So this is my production resource group, and let's create this role assignment. Again, contributor, and let me indicate that in this case I want to use my prod principle, a different identity than we used on dev. And it is done. And by the way, take a look how all this knowledge becomes useful right now. The stuff that I was talking some time ago about this role-based access control. So even though you are not an administrator, just knowing about this stuff, it makes your life easier. All right, so we granted the permissions, but actually we didn't create a service connection in Azure DevOps. We didn't tell Data Factory, we didn't tell Azure DevOps which principle it should use. So actually, let's go to project settings under Azure DevOps. Oh, come on, project settings, and here we should see something called service connections. So that's the place inside which we'll create this connection between Azure DevOps and our Azure environments. And I want to use this Azure Resource Manager option because we are connecting to Azure. And I will use this service principal manual method. Manual because we created those service principal manually. And thanks to this, I was able to set their names in a proper way instead of using some auto-generated ones, which simplifies management in the future. Alright, and now I have to fill various things. That's the downside of doing this manually. So again, I have to provide subscription ID of my Azure subscription to which this service connection should have access to. So let's jump into DP203 resource group. That's my dev environment. And let me copy this subscription ID. Like so. Then let's copy subscription name. It's this Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. Then I've got to indicate which service principal is to be used, which identity should be used when connecting from Azure DevOps to Azure environment. So I've got to provide this service principal ID, which in our case is simply this application client ID of our CICD dev service principal. Right now I'm configuring this connection for dev environment. Later I will do it for prod as well. So let me copy it and let me paste it. And then I've got to provide a secret. I have to authenticate using this service principal. So that's the place inside which I will copy the secret that we generated like 10 minutes ago. That's service principal key. That's the thing. And finally, I've got to provide a tenant ID. That's again something we can find in our app registration, in our service principal. So that's the thing that we've got to provide. Like so. And finally, we've got to provide a name for our service connection, like CICD dev. And let me verify it and save. And hopefully it works. Yep. So the dev connection has been created. And right now I will do something similar for prod. So Azure Resource Manager, that's our connection type. We'll do it manually using a service principal. Then again, I have to provide my subscription ID that I can find, for example, in properties of my prod resource group. Like so. Then the subscription name available in the same place. Then identifier of our service principal. So this is this CICD prod principle that we just created. And we've got to use this application client ID, like so. Let me copy it. Then we've got to, sorry, wrong window, this one. Service principal key, that's the place into which we've got to paste the secret that is used to authenticate, like so. Then the tenant, this one. And finally, let's give it a name, like CICD prod. And let's verify and save. And yep, everything works. So you have those two service connections configured. So we've done this stage. All right, the next thing we've got to do, according to the guide, is to create environments inside Azure DevOps. And you should remember from last time that those environments are super helpful when we want to see what was deployed and when. And also we can use them to set some additional configuration. For example, that deployments to a prod environment, they require an approval. So let's create two environments, one for dev and one for prod. So let's move into environments in Azure DevOps, and let me create two of them. The first one will be called simply dev, and the other one will be called prod. And we'll do additional configuration on the prod environment. We'll enforce this approval. So I will make sure to go into approvals and checks, and then add an approval that it is required to approve this every deployment to this environment by me in this case. So let's create it. I could define some additional checks like hours inside which deployments can be made, or branches from which deployments can be made, but let's leave it for now. Anyway, we've got those two environments defined, and we'll use them here. So basically, our CI/CD pipelines, they will use this dev environment in case of development and deployment, and similarly prod environment when deploying to prod. All right, so what's next in the guide? Well, we are asked to create a variable group. All right, but before we do this, let's actually go into Data Factory, and let's create a linked service, because I want to have something more than just a pipeline inside our Data Factory. So let me create a very simple linked service. But before we do this, we'll obviously have to grant access for our Data Factory managed instance. So actually, let's do this before we create the linked service. So let's jump into the development instance. And here we've got different resources. And I would like to create a linked service to a data lake, the one that we've been using so far, this stable data lake demo. And I want to grant Data Factory access to this data lake. And I will do it explicitly without a group, just to make it faster. And you should remember that the role we want to grant is a storage blob data contributor to allow read and write. And I want to grant it to a managed identity of a Data Factory. And on dev, this is this dev Data Factory table, like so. And let's grant it. All right. We have to do something similar on prod environment. So let me jump to prod, to my prod data lake, into access control, and let me grant it again this storage blob data contributor role. to a managed identity, but this time we'll use a production instance of our data factory. Alright, so this is done. So now we'll be able to create and test a linked service. So let me create a new linked service to a data lake. Let's use system assigned managed identity, so it's a more secure one. Let me indicate which data lake I want to use, and this is this table data lake demo. And let's test this, and it should work. Yep, it works. So actually, let me rename it. Can I rename it here? No, I can't. So I will remove it, and let me create it one more time because I want to use a better name, like ADLS Gin2 linked service, like so. And one more time, system assigned managed identity. Let me indicate which data lake I have in mind. Let's verify this. And it has been created. All right. But it also means that this linked service will be created on a prod instance. And as you can guess, depending on an environment, we should connect to a different data lake. So we would like to parameterize it. And the way to do this is to use these variable groups that were mentioned in the guide. So let's create this variable group, and then I will show you what it means and how to use it. So let's go into library inside Azure DevOps, and let's create a new variable group. Let's call it dev, like so. And let me add some variables. And the point of using those variable groups is that I will be able to point to it, to a specific variable from our CICD pipeline, and then it will grab a specific value. And I will create two groups, one for dev and one for prod, and each of them will store a value that is valid for a given environment. So let me create this variable. I will use this strange name. I will explain in a second why I'm using this one. And I've got to provide some value. So what the value should be used? Well, let me simply copy it from our dev instance, because that's the value that should be used on dev, like so. And let me save it. All right. And let's do something similar for prod. So let me create a new variable group called prod. I will add a new variable with the same name. So it was ADLS Gen2 linked service something something, but the value should be different this time. I will copy the value that we got from dev, but we know that we've got to change this first part, which indicates which data lake, which storage account we have in mind. So let me copy the name from prod and let me paste it here without a space. All right, so the variable group has been created, and right now it contains just this single variable that will allow us to parameterize deployments between dev and prod. All right, so the next thing we have to do is to add a new stage to our pipeline that will actually make the deployment. So let me copy it. Let's go to our repository, and in the ADF Azure Pipelines YAML file, that's the definition of our CICD pipeline. Let's add some additional stage. and let me call it dev, because I want to deploy it to dev basically. Then I've got to indicate which variable group I want to use, and we've just created this variable group and we called it dev. Then I've got to indicate where is my ADF template-job-yml file stored, basically this file, and because they are stored in the same place, I can just do it like so. Just set a file name. Then I've got to indicate which environment I want to use. And again, we've defined those two environments. And this time I will use dev environment because the whole stage is about deployment to dev environment. Then again, I've got to provide a subscription ID. So let me copy it from the previous step. I've got to indicate to which resource group I want to make a deployment, and it will be DP203 because that's our dev environment. Then I've got to provide a name of my dev data factory. So this is it. Then I've got to indicate how I want to authenticate to Azure, basically which service connection name, which service connection I want to use. And when it comes to service connections, we created two, and what was the name of it? It was CICD dev. That's the one that we want to use on dev. CICD dev. And finally, we have a place where we can define parameters that will be applied for this particular deployment on dev. And it follows name and value pattern. In a second, I will show you, or actually I can do it right now. So let me jump into our pipeline that was executed some time ago, and let's take a look. Let's take a look at the artifact that was generated. Because here you've got this ARM template parameters for factory.json file. So let me see what is there. And basically, that's the file that contains various parameters that could be set for my data factory. And by default, ADF is configured in a way that various linked services, various properties of linked services can be automatically parameterized. We don't have to do anything to enable this parameterization. We just need to provide a name for a given parameter, a value, sorry. And we can see that in this case, we have a parameter created with this name that indicates which storage account should be used in this ADLS Gen 2 linked service. If you're wondering why this name looks in this way, or how it is happening that this parameter is automatically created, well, you could go into something called parameter configuration inside Data Factory, and here you would see this strange file that defines what type of things inside the Data Factory can be parameterized. I'm not going to deep dive into this file. You can read about it in documentation. I will provide the link to it. But basically, this file defines what things can be parameterized. And obviously, you can modify it if you would like to parameterize something more. Anyway, what is important in our case is that we have to provide this parameter if you would like to parameterize this particular linked service. And yes, we want to do this. So let me copy name of this parameter, the full name, like so. And let's go to our pipeline and let's paste the name of this parameter. So this is the value, this is the parameter which value will provide. And now, instead of hard coding the value here inside the pipeline, what we could use is to reference our dev variable group, because that was the place inside which we already configured this URL to a data lake. So I will simply reference a value from our variable group. And to do this, you have to use this $ syntax, and in brackets, you would provide a name of the variable defined in the variable group. So let me check how we called this this variable. So that's the name of a variable. We could I don't want to save any changes, so let me copy one more time. Copy without any changes. And actually, we could use any name of the variable we would like. I like to keep it the same as the name of actual parameter, so it's later on easier to understand what we are referring to. All right, and that's it. The stage for that deployment has been configured. So actually, let's do it also for production. So let me copy it, and let me paste it, and then we'll set it for prod deployment as well. So let me call the stage prod. We've got to change a variable group to prod because we have this separate prod variable group that contains stuff for production environment. We will use the same template. It doesn't change, and that's a good thing of using templates, that the majority of your code you can store in some external file in this job, and here in the pipeline we'll just reference it. Then we've got to indicate which environment, which DevOps environment you want to use, and we created this prod environment. Subscription ID is the same. I have the same subscription for dev and prod. Resource group is obviously different, so let me copy the name of the resource group. It's dp2 free prod. The name of data factory will also be different. This is this prod data factory. Service connection name will also be different. And how did we call it? I forgot. Probably CICD prod, but let me double check this. Yep, CICD prod. So CICD prod. And for parameters, we don't have to change anything, because in our prod variable group, we also have this variable that contains a value that is valid for a prod environment. So let me commit this change, and let's see what happens. And by the way, this pipeline is configured in a way that it will automatically start on every change to main branch. So let's see how it works. Let's see if any pipeline is already running. Actually, yes, it started. So you can already see that it has those 3 stages defined: build, deployment to dev, and deployment to prod. And now, because that's the first time we are running it for dev environment, we have to approve the usage of various things. So the first thing we've got to do, and it's a one-time operation, is to allow this pipeline to use dev environment. So yes, let's allow for it. Secondly, we've got to allow for this pipeline to use our CICD dev service connection. Yes, it's fine. And finally, we've got to allow it to use our dev variable group. And yes, this is fine. So we made a consent. it was a one-time operation. We won't have to do it anymore. And it hasn't started. It is initializing. All right, so let's wait for a second. And it started from, or it was triggered by a change in a main branch. But if I recall, in our main branch, do we have our pipeline? Yeah, we have a pipeline, and we have a linked service. Yep, we have something. So our pipeline should be able to deploy it to dev and then prod environments. Obviously, if I didn't make any mistake. But let's wait and let's see how it goes. All right, so it looks that the dev deployment succeeded. So let's jump into our live instance of dev environment and let's see what we have here. So we have our pipeline 1 that we've just configured, and we have a linked service pointing to our typical data lake demo. That's the dev instance of data lake. So far, so good. So let's see if deployment to prod will also succeed. So again, we have to make this one-time constant to use a variable group for prod, to use a prod environment, and to use this CICD prod connection. And apart from that, we have to make an approval just to deploy this CICD pipeline, this artifact to prod. And this approval that I'm talking about, it will happen every time, because that's what we want to do. The previous one, just to use those environments, a variable group and connection name, it was a one-time operation. So let's see what happens, if it will succeed. Fingers crossed. All right, and the prod deployment already finished. It is marked as a success. So let's jump to prod environment and let's verify what we have there. So let me refresh the browser. And do we have any pipeline? Yep, we have our pipeline 1, the one that we just created. And when it comes to linked services, we have this ADLS, a linked service that in our case points to a production data lake. So let me verify if it works. Yep, it works. So basically we are done. In just 1 hour, we managed to create a CICD process for Data Factory. Now, there might be some additional steps you should do. For example, right now, when you finish setting up the CICD stuff, you should get back to the repository and then set additional policies on your main branch, like disallow direct commits to it, and enforce pull request, enforce that every comment in a pull request is resolved, make sure that the change author is not able to approve his own pull request, and so on. But that's something maybe secondary to this topic. But please take a look how simple it was, because we were able to use those plug and play templates from Adam, and they are really plug and play because it took us 1 hour to set it up. So basically there is no excuse right now to say that, well, I don't want to set up CICD for Data Factory because it's too complicated. No, it's not. It's pretty simple, as you can see. Even if it takes you 1 day just to understand exactly what happens under the hood, just to go through this code, it is worth it. So I strongly advise you to just try it and see how much it will improve your life. Now, this flow, this CICD process using ARM templates, it works. It is fine. In many cases, it is good enough. But there are some cases in the case of which it is not usable at all. In the future episode, I will show you a different approach we could use that solves those issues. But as a homework, I encourage you to think about use cases in case of which this approach will not work. But don't worry, I will talk about it next time. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Take care.